Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us at the Economic Research Council for this important discussion on how housing and planning influence economic growth. And a very warm welcome to today's session. We're really delighted to have you with us as we explore the critical role that housing and planning policy is playing shaping the UK's economic landscape. And it's a real privilege to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Professor Paul Cheshire. We're really honoured to have him here to shed some light on some vital connections between housing, planning, and economic growth. Now, Paul is one of the UK's most influential voices in urban economics and geography. He's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and has been awarded a CB for his services to economics and housing. Over his esteemed career, he's authored and co-edited groundbreaking works, including the award-winning Handbook of Regional and Urban Economics and Urban Economics and Urban Policy. Now, his expertise spans housing affordability, land market, spatial inequalities, and planning reforms, which makes him a leading authority on how urban planning can unlock productivity and welfare improvements. So for today's session, Paul will speak for around roughly 30 minutes. This will be followed by a 30-minute Q&A session, like we usually do. And we do encourage you to actively engage, so please do submit any questions that you might have via the chat function that's at the bottom of the screen, and we'll address as many of those as we can after the presentation. In addition to this, if there is anything that you require clarification through the actual discussion, please do feel free to post that in the Q&A section as well. Okay, then without further ado, it's with great anticipation that I welcome Professor Paul Cheshire to share his insights with us today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much for that flattering introduction. I'll try and live up to it. So this is the title of my talk, as I just saw. And what my main purpose is, we know that we've got serious problems with housing affordability, and we know that this is creating real tensions between an inequity between the young compared to the old. I'm the old, I'm living in a house I've paid the mortgage off a long time ago, and I'm very well off as a result, but young people can't afford to buy anywhere decent to live, or indeed to rent anywhere decent to live. And recently the OECD published some data showing that homelessness in Britain is not just the worst in the OECD, but it's an order of magnitude worse than in any other country in the OECD. So we really have got a housing crisis caused by the price of housing primarily. But here I'm going to try and move on from that and talk through some of the implications of this, particularly in the context of the economy as a whole and economic growth. Now, our housing problem is not something that's happened overnight. It's been building up now for 60 or 70 years, in fact. And if you compare how many houses we built in the last 30 years compared to the previous 30 years, it was short by 3 million or more. So we've got a real crisis of housing supply in total. But one of my main points is that houses are locationally specific. They're in particular places. So not only do we have an aggregate shortage of house building, but where we are building them, we're tending to build them where they're not most needed. So if we look at the 40 years to 2018, we find that in relatively depressed local economies, which are not growing, Barnsley and Doncaster added together, we built 2.5 houses for every extra person who came to live there. Whereas in Oxford and Cambridge, very prosperous, rapidly growing economies, we only built 1/3 of a house for every new resident. And it matters, therefore, where houses are built. So, my vital message is that houses are complex goods, as economists call them. They've got many attributes, varying attributes, and of those attributes, location is by far the most important. A house in Hartlepool or in St Helens in Lancashire is not a substitute for a house in Oxford or in St Albans. So we need to build them where excess demand for housing is greatest, which is where they're most unaffordable, of course. And that isn't just for equity reasons, for fairness, it's also for economic growth, because real unaffordability of housing is the market telling you that there is potential gains in productivity and welfare by letting people be able to afford to live there, because that's where their pounds are telling you they most want to live. So if you just look at this is a plot of housing affordability. That's the ratio of median local house prices to median local incomes in 2023 for all of the all of the local authorities in England. Darker the blue, the less affordable it is. So the least affordable place outside London to buy a house is St Albans, where the ratio of median house prices to incomes was 17.6. And the best place, or the least unaffordable, was Burnley at 3.73. But even 3.73 is, by the sort of international criteria, regarded as relatively unaffordable. And this is the change in that affordability ratio between 2002 and 2023. And again, the darker colours indicate a greater increase in unaffordability. And we can see that houses are not just most unaffordable in the Greater Southeast, but they have become relatively less affordable in the Greater Southeast. There's an interesting little place up there, York. I might just mention York again a bit later. But what we can see is that there's been this huge explosion of loss of affordability over a lot of England, but particularly in the southeast and around London. Now, how does building houses impact growth or welfare? Well, first of all, there's the obvious direct impact that if you build more houses, say you build an extra 100,000 houses in a year, then that's going to have wages will increase in the construction industry. There will be additional inputs bought, and since construction has a relatively high domestic content, that in turn will have quite a significant multiplier effect on the economy. So there's that sort of direct effect, but that isn't the most interesting effect. Some people say that England built its way out of the 1930s depression by hugely increasing house building, but that was the direct effect. But here we're dealing with, I'm more interested in these induced effects. And the first of these is that there are agglomeration economies are much more important than traditional economics realized. And there's been a lot of research by urban economists over the last 25 years showing that there is a direct impact between city size and productivity. All things equal, a larger city, people are more productive than in a smaller city. And also, this is more recent still, there seem to be vertical agglomeration economies, that is in taller office buildings, we're looking at workspaces, everything else equal, people are actually more productive in taller office buildings. And of course, if you exploit agglomeration economies by allowing our most productive and larger cities to grow, that reduces commuting time and costs, which increases productivity. And you have more people will tend to work in offices. And again, productivity of people working in offices, by and large, is better than productivity of people working at home, although, now particularly that's true for younger workers. So one, build more houses in the right place, and you can expand our agglomeration economies, which will lead to more growth for the economy as a whole. Secondly, there's a positive marginal productivity of space in houses and in workspaces like retail or warehouses or offices or laboratories or research and development. So one of the impacts of having very expensive housing and land is that they're smaller. And that is true also of offices or warehouses or particularly shops. And I'll talk about that in some detail in a moment. So you have potential productivity gains simply from having more space within which people can work. You also have productivity gains from unconstrained locational choice. Surprise, surprise, employers are better able to decide on the most productive locations for their activities than are central planners or government officials. So there are both micro and macro effects. Micro effects, I'll talk about that in the context of retail and how the productivity of shops varies dramatically with exactly where it's located and what its site characteristics. But also you have cross-regional effects. So one of the things that government has done over the last 10, 15 years is to force bits of the broadcasting industry to go to the regions. BBC, for example, to Salford. Now that threatens to break up agglomeration economies in one of the industries in which we are most competitive as a country, which is the media. Because one of the advantages of the media is you have very important agglomeration economies in the media, and those tend to be strongest in London and other centres like existing centres like Bristol and to an extent Birmingham and Glasgow. But you need to reinforce the strengths, not dilute them, if you're going to make your media industries and other similar industries like research and development more productive. And finally, there are direct income and welfare gains from cheaper, bigger houses. If we have cheaper houses, then there's more income left over to spend on other things. In addition, bigger houses generate more welfare, all things equal, than smaller houses do. So why is housing so unaffordable in London? Well, the most important single reason, I would argue, is that we have restricted land supply via green belts. And we've done that systematically over a very long time, since 1955, when the London Green Belt was imposed in its present form. So the green belt has nothing to do, and this is an important point to get across, nothing to do with nature or the environment or preserving countryside for people to enjoy. What it has to do is only to stop building, to stop what is called towns merging. And it was enforced in 1955, and the London Green Belt stretches from the North Sea all the way to the edge of Aylesbury. It's a very big area. It's about 4 times the size of the GLA area. And even within the GLA area, as you can see, there are a substantial amount of green belts. So down in the southeast here in Bromley, or here in Havering, or out here in the northwestern fringe, a lot of what is actually administratively London is in fact unable to be developed because it's green belt land. And this generates huge pressures as people fight to stop building happening locally, because they have moved to an area where the green belt is and they don't want it to be lost to them. But on the other hand, the rest of the country needs houses, and it needs houses where they allow people to be more productive. So one of the unintended consequences of green belts is it doesn't actually stop all urban sprawl. So this is a map showing where commuting to London has increased proportionately most between 2001 and 2011. So for every local authority area, it shows the increase in commuting to London for people who work in London. Of course, it may be very small numbers, it's a percentage increase, but what you can immediately see is that the increase in commuting to London is hugely dispersed, as people have to jump over the green belt to find affordable space for housing. So as I was saying earlier about York and fall in affordability in York, there's York. It's one of the, amazingly enough, it's the best part of 2 hours from London, but it's one of the fastest growing commuter stations servicing London, or places out here like Bicester, for example, or down here in the southeast of Kent, particularly with the Javelin line opening up, or down here in Bournemouth, or down here in Brighton. So we've had this dispersion of people jumping across the greenbelt as a result of the inability to afford housing space because of our restrictions on land supply. And that, of course, has negative effects on productivity, because more time is spent actually commuting and less time is spent on working. Now, the other problem is that we don't just restrict outward spread of London land supply, we also have incredibly restrictive height restrictions in London. So this map here shows you the areas of London in which you cannot build a tall building. A tall building is something like above 7 or 8 stories. So here around the centre of London, these are protected areas around St Paul's and the Monument. But these yellowy lines that you can see going out here are protected sight lines. So there are views of, for example, St Paul's that are protected in 16 different directions by these sight lines. You cannot build a building above the level of the dome of St Paul's in that sight line. And then you have to add to that the fact that there are 2 or 3 London boroughs where more than 75% of the area is a conservation zone. So all these purplish coloured areas are conservation areas. And in conservation areas, you can't change buildings at all. So you cannot build a taller building. So space is completely frozen in terms of its availability. Okay, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we get benefits from having beautiful views in cities and preserving our historic cityscape. We do. And the view, I think, from for example, from the Tate Modern across to St. Paul's is a really great urban view. But we protect these views without any looking at the costs and the benefits. Because there are costs as well as benefits associated with protecting views. So this here is a nice picture of a protected view of St. Paul's from King Henry's Mount in Richmond. That's 16 kilometers away. And now here we have a telephoto lens on our camera, and we can actually see St. Paul's just about. But 300 days a year, you can't see St. Paul's because it's drizzly like it was today, or it's dirty, or there's haze in the air. It's just not visible. So that view is really only exists in the mind's eye. It doesn't exist in reality. And the benefits that it generates by preserving it are, I would argue, really vanishingly small. But you can't build anything higher than that area. So it completely blankets the supply of higher rise buildings and more densification of London. Now, so there are substantial wider economic costs of our planning system, and I'm going to start off by illustrating this with respect to retail and look particularly at what's called town centre first policy that was introduced in 1996, almost at the whim of a minister, without any investigation or research at all as to what the effects would be. And the aim was to keep traditional town centres, to protect the high street, and it was the town centre first policy introduced stringent tests to prevent new stores, new retail, and other so-called traditional town centre activities from locating away from town centres. First of all, if you wanted to build a new store, I'm going to talk about retail here, you had to pass a needs test. That was a purely formulaic test about the square foot of retail space relative to the population in any given city. So you had to show that there was a need for more shopping space in the city if you wanted to build a new shop. But then there was also a sequential test introduced. That is, you could only build on a site, on any site, if there was no site available nearer to the town centre. So you always were required to build on the site nearest to the town centre, not necessarily on the site that you wanted to build on. Now, when a site was available, all that meant was that it had been identified on the plan, on the local plan, as reserved for retail. The fact that it might be, your Sainsbury's and it might be owned by Tesco's, and therefore the last thing that Tesco's want to do is to sell it to you, was neither here nor there. That wasn't relevant, nor was the suitability of the site for actual retail activity. And the outcome was that new stores were forced to smaller sites chosen by planners, not by retailers. And that's one of the reasons why small independent stores have disappeared from our high streets, either to be taken over by mini markets of the big stores because they needed to get exposure to shoppers in where they could, or of course they've just gone out of business entirely because they're not viable as shops and they're empty, or they're gift shops or they're charity shops. Now, how did we test this? We managed to get detailed data for all the stores in one of the big four supermarket chains. We got the critical variables, we got the exact location, we got the floor space of the store, we got the sales of the store, we got the employment in the store, and we got a proxy for capital, which was the space for stocks. And then we were therefore able to estimate a production function, showing the productivity of labour, capital, and land. And including land in the production function is quite unusual in economics, I have to say. that we wanted to know whether bigger stores were, everything else equal, more productive than smaller stores. And then, of course, we had to combine that with other variables, including the restrictiveness of the local authority, measured by the rate at which its propensity to refuse applications for development over a long period, averaged over a long period. We looked at how the stores had to compete with other local stores and the local area characteristics, incomes, etc., population catchment, etc., for the store. And we got data for 331 stores, 269 in England, and the rest in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And then what we did was we exploited the fact that the policy of town centre firsts was introduced in 1996 in England, not at all in Scotland or Northern Ireland to begin with, and even when it was introduced in Scotland, it was much more sensible and less stringent than in England, and they never had this sequential test. So what we were trying to do was estimate a production function for this retailer, including land as a factor of production. And the advantage for that of our data set was that we had it for a single firm, so that there was homogeneous management. So none of the variation in productivity across stores could be related to different management of the firms. And then, of course, we were able to compare the productivity of new stores in England after the policy came in with those in Scotland and Northern Ireland. So what did we do? We tested a number of things. Were there fewer and smaller stores opening up in more restrictive local authorities? Secondly, were bigger stores, all else equal, more productive in terms of total factor productivity? That is, was there a positive rate of return to bigger stores being bigger, independently of other factors? And then we wanted to look at total factor productivity in stores directly as a result of the town centre first policy. Did it change the productivity of stores, all else equal, in England compared to elsewhere? New stores, I should say. We had some econometric problems. We got round that, and this was published in a quite respectable journal, and so it was refereed. But essentially, what we were trying to do was quantify the impact of planning policies using a spatial difference in difference approach on the sort of assumption that English stores were what we call treated, but those in northern Scotland were untreated. But in fact, they were, of course, less treated. They weren't utterly untreated. So what we're able to estimate is a lower bound of the effects of this town centre first policy. So looking at our most robust model, what we found was that all else held equal, a one standard deviation increase in local authority and restrictiveness, measured on this refusal of planning applications measure, reduces the probability of there being a store at all by 26%. Not only were there less likely to be new stores in more restrictive local authorities, which implied, of course, that people would have to travel further to get to the stores, but those stores are tended to be smaller, so and therefore less productive, since we had already estimated that there was a positive marginal effect of more space. And the combined effect of fewer smaller stores means that a one standard deviation increase in local authority restrictiveness reduced the chain's sales in that local authority by 32%. Now, that's a pretty large number. And as I said, we estimated a positive marginal productivity effect of more floor space, a 10% increase in floor space, all else equal, increased sales by 1.5%. So smaller stores were less productive. Now, in addition, looking at these sort of difference in difference approach, what we found was that new stores in England, after the policy came in, were, everything else equal, less productive. And the overall reduction in total factor productivity in English stores post-1996 was nearly 32%. So our best estimate is that in the supermarket sector, total factor productivity was reduced by 32% as a result of that planning policy. And most of that loss of productivity was not because the small stores were smaller, but because they were located on intrinsically difficult sites to work on or poorer locations. And location in retail is absolutely critical. We also did this for another retail sector and found very similar results, but I'll cut that out since I'm trying to keep to time there. So that's one clear-cut case where you've got a really big hit to total factor productivity as a result of a particular planning policy, which is still in place, the town centre first policy. And if you'd walked into a minister's office in the Treasury in 1996 and said, I've got this jolly good idea for a policy that might protect town centres. In fact, we've done other research that shows that it didn't, that might protect town centres, but it would actually be associated with a 32% loss of productivity. You'd have been laughed out of the office, but no one has really evaluated it in terms of its economic effects. Now, the second peculiarity of our planning system I want to talk about is the fact that we have a discretionary system. Across the world, most planning systems are like the master planning system or the zoning planning system, where in principle, the outcome of a desire of an application to build is certain. It's certain because you have rules. If you read the plan, and the rules are clear in what you can build where, then you can build what you want to do as long as it conforms to the plan. But that isn't true in Britain or in some of our ex-colonies, I have to say, as I'll show you in a moment. In Britain, we have a discretionary system. There may be a local plan, or one of the features of the last 10 years is that fewer and fewer local authorities even have a plan. It's now down to well below 30% of local authorities have even got a valid local plan. But anyway, they were never more than guidance. Decisions were actually made by local politicians who were subject to lobbying. That meant that there were additional uncertainty in the development process. Development is an uncertain business anyway, because you're spending a lot of money now for a future expected return. Now, if you increase the risk of development, then you increase the necessary risk premium, and therefore it means that fewer projects are past the test and therefore more housing doesn't get built. So having a discretionary and uncertain outcome to our system means that there will always be a barrier to building because of the risk premium that's associated with simply getting through the planning system. And also, since we're so intentionally constraining the supply of development, particularly of land, then there's a rent available if you manage to persuade the planning committee to allow you to do what it is you want to do. And this induces lobbying or gaming by developers to try to get permission for their projects. And economists would call this rent-seeking behavior. Now, rent-seeking behavior is a deadweight loss in economic terms. All it does, it generates no welfare, but people employ resources to do it, and it simply means that there are money gains for some developers compared to unsuccessful developers. Now, you can see from this diagram here, this shows the increase in real house prices from 1975 to 2000 across a selection of OECD countries. And what you can, there's the mean for OECD there. That England is right up, Britain is right up here with some of the worst increase in the real cost of housing of any country in the OECD. The only ones that is worse is New Zealand, although New Zealand has actually done something about it in the last year or so. And then Canada and Australia. What do those countries have in common? They have in common a discretionary planning system rather than a master planning system or a rules-based planning system. It's only a correlation. One needs to show positive proof of causation, but it is highly suggestive, I would argue. And I can now illustrate this in the context of a slightly peculiar thing, which is the height of offices built in London. Now, as I've already said, there are economies of scale in vertical agglomeration economies. People are more productive, all else equal, in taller offices. Now, one of the peculiarities about London is that we have this, it's very difficult to build a high-rise building. And this is a quote from the then minister, John Prescott. when he approved the Shard in 2003, he'd only approved skyscrapers of exceptional design. For buildings of this size to be acceptable, the quality of its design is critical. The proposed tower is the highest architectural quality. How did John Prescott, not a noted architectural critic, know it was of the highest quality? Because it was designed by Renzo Piano, who'd won not the first of the Lifetime Achievement Awards available to architects, but just won second of his Lifetime Achievement Award. So he was a very famous architect. Now, one of the peculiarities is that the incidence of skyscrapers, that is 100 meters or more tall, varies across the world's cities remarkably. Hong Kong has 8 times as many per person as New York, for example. Brisbane has 6 times as many per person as Paris. Brisbane is just a small city. Paris is a big city. Paris has 8 times as many as London does. But one league which London does top is the proportion of its skyscrapers, which are designed by what I call trophy architects. Simply architects who've won one of the big 3 Lifetime Achievement Awards, Pritzker, the gold medal of the American Architectural Association, etc. Now, in London, 25% of what are skyscrapers are designed by trophy architects. Chicago, it is pretty unregulated, but it also is the home of modern architecture, you might argue, has only got 3%. Brussels, which is a very flexible planning system, has none at all. Why is that? Because employing a trophy architect successfully games the system. It persuades the local politicians and planners that your building is a brilliant building and should be allowed to be built taller, even though in general that's difficult in London. So what we find is that when we do the analysis, that a trophy architect designed building in London is 14 stories taller than a non-trophy architect designed building, and that increases the site value by 152%. Now, trophy architects don't come cheap, so there are extra costs, but what you can deduce from that is that employing a trophy architect involves an economic rent of something like £148 million per representative site. And that is a measure of the costs of rent seeking in this way. So how do we measure this? We got a sample of 2,039 office sales over a 20-year period. We got a lot of detail on the buildings, their exact locations. Then we divided them up between those that were on office buildings that were on height-controlled sites, from that earlier map, like they were in conservation areas or in one of the sight lines, so they couldn't be tall, and those that weren't. And what we've then looked at was the impact of having a trophy designed architect on the height of the building. So what we found was that on not strictly controlled sites, that is not height controlled sites, you could get 14.29 additional floors if your building was designed by a trophy architect. Also, the price per square meter was higher where the local authority was more restrictive, or indeed on height-controlled sites because it was more difficult, so there was a scarcity of tall office buildings. And we also find a height premium, which is consistent with this idea of vertical agglomeration economies. Taller office buildings, everything else equal, were more valuable than shorter ones. How do we know it's the employment of a trophy architect that causes this extra height? Well, we compared the situation in London with that in Chicago. Chicago is well known to be not restrictive. You can build tall buildings there, and on average, offices in Chicago are 30 floors taller than they are in London. But what you found was that in London, when an architect became a trophy architect, lo and behold, their offices grew by 14.37 floors. Whereas in Chicago, there was no statistically significant effect on the height of their buildings at all. So it was by becoming a trophy architect that the architect was able to build taller buildings and increase their fees. So that's a very quick run around of some of the costs of having a discretionary system. I think I'm running out of time, so I'll speed through this. Here are some easy-ish gains. We're talking presently about the grey belt. I'm very happy to talk about the grey belt. I did a study for the the Centre for Cities a few years ago, showing that there was room around London's commuter stations to build 1 million houses on what is presently green belt land if you would release it and allow it to happen. And that would be rail-based development, so very energy efficient. Another area where I mentioned earlier on that, that we don't look at the costs as well as the benefits of having conservation areas as extensively as we do. So more than 10% of all dwellings in England are preserved in conservation areas. Conservation areas are not technically defined. They are largely, again, they're politically defined. I've got a colleague who did a paper on that in 2017, showing how when an area gentrifies, it then tends to become a conservation area. But the problem is that, of course, the rules of conservation areas don't just prevent you from building taller buildings or densification, but they effectively prevent you from increasing the energy efficiency of obsolete buildings. So reaching our net zero targets. For example, you cannot install double glazing in houses in conservation areas. That's one of the reasons I moved to my present more modern house, that it was going to cost me something like £100,000 to renew the windows in the house I did live in a conservation area, and even then I couldn't have them double glazed. You can't install solar panels. It's difficult and expensive to install insulation that conforms with the rules of conservation areas. And certainly you can't build up higher. So that there are substantial costs in energy terms, but also in terms of space availability of having such extensive conservation area preservation. And there are ways that you could change the regulations without in any way reducing the value of conservation areas by, for example, permitting double glazing in matched materials, by allowing solar panels that weren't too visible, by helping to relax regulations so you can install heat pumps, which again is difficult in conservation areas. So that would also be associated, of course, with increasing economic growth. Finally, we could trial having a master planning system. That is a rule-based system rather than the discretionary system that we presently have. And that would reduce the risk of development. For example, you could get London or Manchester, Birmingham to experiment with having a rules-based system. It would require some investment in preparing proper master plans that had parcel level development possibilities and set out the rules by which you could build or not build. But you could pilot this in a couple of big city regions. And then you could compare what the impact was on the costs of building and supply of housing and other buildings compared to what it had been before you went to a rules-based system. And I think you'd probably find that there were big advantages and growth advantages for the economy as a whole from doing that. So just to wind up, conventional modern economics fails to take account of the critical importance of location and site characteristics, both in terms of the value and the welfare derived from houses, but also, and this is even more important for the point of view, from the productivity of a wide range of economic activity. Now, I illustrated that with respect to retail, where you had a 32% loss of total factor productivity by forcing new retail onto sites that were poorly located or bad layout. But this is also true of things like the media or cultural services, where there are important clustering economies, business and financial services, research and development, higher education. All these are activities which are more productive and more effective when they can choose their own locations, and the people who run those activities are better able to choose those locations to enhance productivity than politicians or even local planners. And the other thing, of course, is that space itself influences productivity. I showed you that bigger shops were more productive, but it's also true that bigger offices, everything else equal, are more productive. And we have such restrictive policies that, for example, in Birmingham, take the case of Birmingham, whilst it cost half as much per square metre to build an office building of any given a number of floors, the price of renting it per square meter was 44% more than it was in Manhattan. So we're creating a world in which office space is hugely increased in price because of the regulation and restrictions on the quantity of it and on its height. And since we have evidence of vertical agglomeration economies, we know that we're losing productivity as a result. So serious-minded reform of planning is not just to alleviate our housing crisis, but it is also to boost productivity and growth. But of course, the reforms have to take account of the impact of space and location on productivity. I've gone on a bit over time, but I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to take this questions and discussion. There's some references.
That's perfect. Thank you very much, Paul. I really appreciate that. It's incredibly informative, and I'm really keen and eager to get stuck into some of these ideas that you've mentioned. So again, if people have got any questions, please do feel free to start posting them in the Q&A session. I'll get started with some as people type things in. I can see a few coming in here. Just firstly, I guess looking at the idea of kind of greenbelt land and building on it, as well as some of the ideas that you've talked about with regards to conservation areas as well. Obviously, these are quite politically challenging aims, even kind of suggesting that we expand house building on the greenbelt and adapt ideas around conservation areas. I know we've had recent by-elections that have been swayed a lot by ideas around house building in certain areas. How do we get to a level of public understanding where we can kind of see some of the benefits that you've mentioned in your presentation today and get kind of more widespread acceptance of that idea?
I think the interesting thing actually is that it's much more acceptable than just looking at the media or the listening to the protests would think it was. That when you have random samples of the population, generally they're quite in favor of building on small bits of the green belt. I mean, even readers of the Daily Telegraph, who I would have initially thought were sort of prime candidates for being against building on the green belt, there was a piece that they ran about 5 years ago arguing for building on sensible bits of the green belt. The thing is, you can build on there's so much green belt that you won't take much land if you relax it. So they had this quite sensible, in my view, sensible article saying you should be allowed to build on. And lo and behold, they did an electronic poll of readers, and 48% of the readers agreed with this assertion. So I think that politicians are terrified of a problem that is the outcome of a relatively small number of influential and loud voices, but doesn't take account of the interests of the wider society. And the other reason for that, of course, is that any development involves costs. You have to accept that, and that those costs are very local. So if I've chosen to live in Sevenoaks, which is 93% of which is greenbelt, then I'm very happy with my choice and I want to defend that. So particularly if people want to build houses across the road from me in what's presently a field, that's going to cause short-term disruption, noise and nastiness, but it's also going to obstruct my view. I'll be passionately against it. And since I'm quite likely retired, if I live in Sevenoaks, I've got plenty of time on my hands to pursue my opposition. But on the other hand, the benefits of building houses are spread out over an awfully large number of people in rather sort of quite thinly, and they don't have enough incentive on their own to cause a lot of noise and go on marches and argue for building on the greenbelt. It's very difficult to get a march of people wanting to build on the greenbelt, but it's very easy to get a march of people saying, don't build on the greenbelt here.
Yeah, understood. Thank you. And as just linked in with some of the ideas around conservation areas, someone just asked, isn't it an exaggeration to say that you can't build new buildings at all in conservation areas? And isn't it just that new buildings have to enhance a conservation area?
But the reality is that the rules of conservation areas do vary a little bit from conservation area to conservation area. For example, I was taken to task in my assertion that you can't put double glazing into buildings in conservation areas, because apparently, I haven't checked it out, but I'm told that the conservation areas in Kensington and Chelsea do allow the double glazing to be installed as long as it's in matching materials. But the one that I lived in did not, because they didn't allow double glazing because technically there's a difference in the refractive index of double glazed windows compared to single glazed windows. I couldn't see it, you couldn't see it, but it exists. Um, so it may be that there is that occasionally, and indeed, my wonderful institution, the London School of Economics, employs very expensive architects in order to get round the conditions that prevent you from changing the appearance of buildings. We've got two new buildings. Well, no, we got. My office is in a refurbished building, which is a listed building, where we had I won't name the architect, but you certainly will have heard of him. We employed a very expensive architect and persuaded Westminster that, because we were the London School of Economics and it was being done by Lord so-and-so, lo and behold, it was going to be a wonderful enhancement of the area. And we even managed to get permission to knock down a listed building and reconstruct it with a wonderful modern piece of building. It's probably the most expensive academic building in the world per square meter, I would say, per square meter of usable space, because a lot of its space is not usable because it's but so yes, it's possible to, but the ease of doing it will vary from conservation area to conservation area to some extent, but it is extremely costly to do it, even when you can do it. And since it covers about 10%, 1.5 million houses are in conservation areas, what I'm saying is broadly true. It may not be exactly true in every case, but even where it isn't true, it's still going to be a very expensive way of getting development.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a couple of these questions just relating to agglomeration effects at the same time. The first one is, can a city get too large, leading to decreases in agglomeration effects? Didn't the World Bank find this happened in cities over 9 million people? And kind of related to that, if you see cities grow over time and within those locations that are kind of most beneficial for that growth, how do you ensure that those benefits are felt in other areas of the country as well?
Well, on the first one, there are costs which increase with city size, and there are economies which increase with city size, if you like. So bigger cities have higher costs. They have more congestion. They have higher space costs. They tend to have more crime. As Ed Glazer famously says, if you're close enough to someone to learn from them, you're close enough to give them a nasty disease. So dense cities have costs, and the bigger they are, they tend to be denser. Now, the question is, where do you get into diminishing returns to size? And there, the research that I'm familiar with suggests that you don't, as long as you have sensible policies to offset for the costs. So in London has exactly the reverse of sensible policies. That is, it's got a prohibition on new land for development. So that increases the costs of space in London. We've already seen there's something like a paper I published with a colleague in the Economic Journal showed that there was something equivalent to a tax of 500% on the costs of constructing office space in London. We know that office space per square meter in London is twice the price of New York. We know that housing per square meter is twice the price of Paris, for example, which is another very expensive city. So space is more expensive in bigger cities, and that's one of the costs of size. But you can have policies which offset for those costs of size, like you can invest in good transport systems. The Elizabeth line has done wonders for congestion on London's underground system. You can invest in, I would argue, road pricing, congestion pricing, proper congestion pricing, not what we have in London, in order to reduce transport costs and congestion costs. But London tends to spend much more money on road narrowing than it does on improving roads in my experience. So you can have policies, you can have policies for greater safety in cities, which is another, crime tends to increase with them. Not just that when I'm close enough to people to learn from them, I'm also not only close enough to give them contagious diseases, I'm close enough to mug them as well. So we can have, bigger cities have their problems. That's certainly true. But, Beijing has got 50 million people in it. The Pearl River Delta complex of cities probably has more than 50 million people in it. There doesn't seem to be a limit on how big cities can be and be more productive as a result, but it has to be in a way you have to have policies which reduce the cost of size compared to increasing the cost of size. Another one, of course, is by allowing buildings to be taller in bigger cities, which again, London singularly restricts.
Thank you. Okay. Another question here. Are you involved with the government's planned policy changes, and what do you expect the outcome to be in the coming years?
I'm involved in the sense that I've been writing pieces which I hope are constructively critical, trying to argue that they should be more radical than they are, and also particularly they should be much clearer in what they're trying to do. So I have to say, you can see various blogs and pieces I've written. I, at the moment, fear that the definition of grey belt will have very little impact at all, because I think that the power of the local NIMBY brigades is extremely great in resisting it. And how do you define unless you have an absolutely clear-cut definition of what the grey belt is, then first of all, those local authorities where there's a strong lobby not to build will find reasons to say not grey belt. And secondly, you will have to go to appeal to get permission to build. And that itself is not only very expensive, but it's a subjective issue as to whether it's substantially contributing to the purposes of the green belt, which is what I think the present definition is. Whereas, I would argue that you should say any land within 800 meters of a commuter station, you can identify that land and you can identify what you mean by a commuter station, which doesn't serve some environmental or other purpose, it's not a public amenity in any way, that land should be a presumption in favor of development. That's grey belt land and you can build on it. And that actually, as I said, if you look at that Centre for Cities paper we did, that releases something like land for about 1 million houses just in London, and spread out across another 4 big cities would be another 1 million houses. And then there are other cities as well that have green belts. So since green belts cover exactly the land where people most want to live, and you can see that through the cost of housing, then that's where releasing land will be most effective.
I've read some of those posts that you mentioned that are on the LSE blog, I believe. I'll link those to the event page so that anybody can find them afterwards. So looking at the idea of a zonal-based planning system, how would you ensure that you maintain kind of design quality in that type of system? And I guess another question, when you look at the trials that you potentially suggested in London and Manchester, what kind of metrics will be used to evaluate their success, I guess?
Well, I think that second question is a good one. You'd have to think carefully about your research methodology. I think, zonal-based systems, I think the most successful planning systems around the world tend to be in continental Europe. Germany, Switzerland, France have got planning systems that seem to control urban development, but largely, but not entirely, do so without increasing house prices exorbitantly. Now, Germany is beginning to run into some problems, and in Switzerland, there's a certain there's actually a sort resistance to building more. There's a desire to have more restrictive planning. But the other thing, of course, is that I haven't mentioned at all is it interacts with our local government finance system in this country. Because in this country, if a local authority does allow building, they get more residents, but they don't get more, and they have more obligations to those residents, but they don't get more money to provide the services and the infrastructure to service those residents, because the council tax doesn't even begin to cover the costs of local government. Whereas in, for example, Switzerland, you have a local income tax. So local authorities are quite keen to get more residents, because they get more residents, then they get more revenues. And similarly in the United States, with commercial property taxes, the revenues from commercial property taxes are 100% a local revenue. They don't go to the government, whereas in Britain, they go to the national government. So local authorities are very keen to have commercial premises in American communities, because they get the revenue, and they think that the commercial users actually cost them less in terms of public services than residential users do. So it's not just the planning system. We have an infernal moment or sort of combination of a dysfunctional planning system and a dysfunctional local government finance system, which, apart from anything else, has meant many local planning departments are completely badly funded, have fallen apart like the justice system.
Okay. I'll maybe try and get a couple of more questions in now before we end. Um, do you believe that the emptiness in many buildings in central London is a hindrance to economic growth?
I beg your pardon?
Sorry, do you believe that the emptiness of many of the buildings in central London are a hindrance to economic growth?
Well, housing is certainly not empty in central London. Far from it. It's extremely expensive. Of course, we're still adjusting to the post-COVID period. When the work from home was really happened, and one of the features of having the system that we've got in London with very, very extensive commuting, so our commuting is far further because people are jumping in the green belt, as I said, is that the incentive to work at home is stronger than it would be if you had cheaper housing in the city itself, which we don't have. So London has been slower to get back to the office than a lot of continental European cities have been. Although most of the research suggests that people are more productive in offices rather than working from home, although working from home is productive for some of the week for many people. So that's going to make offices less intensively used. And there's also this issue of obsolescence. The demand for modern office buildings in London is very strong. And the price of modern office buildings is presently increasing. But there's still a lot of obsolete office buildings, which are relatively difficult to let, and they're much more likely to be empty. And of course, that's even truer of shops, because one of the, we've got an awfully old and obsolete retail estate, and there's a lot of empty shops, which are not really very suitable for housing. But we have introduced this permitted development right where you can convert them into housing.
And I guess very quickly before we end then, how do you believe the reduction of council houses has impacted housing supply and house prices and rents in the last 40 to 50 years?
I think that we've moved from the world of the 1950s and 1960s, where you had councils were themselves big providers of social housing. There are very few councils in England. Scotland still there are, but in England there are very few councils that have substantial stock of so-called council housing. And I think that they've lost the skills both to develop, skill development is a very specific skill. We shouldn't think that developers don't know what they're doing. They do. And so councils are generally not very efficient at maintaining their building stock, and even less efficient now at building it. Historically, they were quite good developers. There was some quite good, and still in London, there is some quite good council housing from before the Second World War and fairly quickly soon after it. Built to quite a high standard. But that is no longer the case. So councils have more or less been forced out. I mean, partly they've declined, but partly they've been forced out of it by the right to buy. And the fact that the money that was yielded by right to buy didn't go back into building affordable housing. So social housing associations have taken over that role. And we do, because housing is so expensive, I think there's a very strong case for having a specific sector providing affordable housing at below market prices for those people who are unable to get their lives together or be in circumstances that allow them to enter the market for housing. You know, again, going to Switzerland, where housing is much cheaper relative to people's incomes, and they have a much more protective social security system, they don't actually have much affordable housing because most people can afford to get housing through the market. So it's not really a crisis of affordable housing, in my view. It's a crisis of housing affordability, including a lack of affordable housing.
Yeah,
No,
that makes sense.
my daughter, who's a lawyer, lives in a shoe cupboard, more or less. It's not just poor people who can't afford
Yeah, yeah,
substantial
yeah,
houses. It's an awful lot of Londoners and other
yeah,
people around the country.
yeah. No, I completely agree. On that note, then, as we have just ticked over 8 o'clock, I just want to say a big thank you to Paul. Thank you very much for your time and effort in that presentation and discussion. Thank you very much to everybody who has joined the event today and as well for your engagement and your questions as well. Please do have a look on our website for any future upcoming events, and we hope to see you again at those discussions. Paul, just again, thank you very much. I really appreciate the time you've taken, and I hope you have a lovely evening.
I'll just tell you about York. York is a small housing market, so a few people move to York. That increases house prices. Manchester's a very big city, so any commuting from Manchester has much less effect on the housing market. Leeds, similarly, there are people who commute from Leeds, but it's a big city.
Perfect. If you don't mind, I can email you across some of these questions that we haven't managed to answer and get those out.
Happy to do that. Okay, nice to see you all. Okay, bye.
Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening. Take care.